Recently, we've been talking about some big projects, and we're talking about doing risk analysis and risk reports. And it seems like whatever we get to a point where we have a project that's bigger than the last project we had, we start to get worried and fearful about what may be happening with this new project and what happens if the project goes south. So we start to look at risk analysis, and there's a lot of misunderstanding related to risk in this field. So risk is simply a mathematical equation. It's the probability of something occurring times the cost of that occurrence or the consequence of that occurrence. Risk does not have to be based in dollars and cents, but in general, it's usually easiest to base risk in dollars and cents because it's one of the easiest currencies that we seem to know to work with. So we think of a channel of risk evolution, and we've looked at different ways of Simon's channel evolution model as well as methods of other people that put together evolution models, and we know that you have channels that will evolve from one state to another state. So the risk of you going from a quasi-equilibrium state to a degradation state is going to be related to whatever circumstances are occurring at that time. But there are known responses. So risk has to be related to your boundary conditions, your goals and objectives, your situations, your existing conditions, geomorphic assessment type of thing. So it has to be related to some sort of process. We think of risk, and we think of a lot of stormwater BMPs, how stormwater affects a change in morphology, and that's going to be one of the things that can affect what our risk is. We have problems related to current stormwater BMPs related to failure, so we have an inherent risk internal to that stormwater BMP, and the failure of that BMP is going to be related to the risk of the failure of the project or the stream downstream of what we're looking at. So we know that most of, and we talked about this the last couple of weeks, most of sedimentation in watersheds seem to come from stream bank erosion. So a change in morphology or BMP may have an effect in risk downstream. But all I'm trying to say here is risk is compounded. So we have risk of a stormwater BMP failure, and then that risk of that stormwater BMP failure will be related to the risk of the downstream geomorphic adjustment that could occur by that failure of that BMP that then would cause land loss, that then would cause more compounding risk downstream with an increased sediment load. So we think about what are some types of risks that we deal with. When we think about risk, the idea is, a lot of times we think of fear and risk as being kind of the same thing. So we're fearful of something happening, so we say, well, we want to know what our risk assessment is, and that fear will cause us to do a risk assessment. But a risk is not a fear. A fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that something or someone is dangerous, likely to cause you pain or threaten you. Simply, I have the fear of indigestion if I eat something wrong. But there's also a risk associated with it. Well, if I want to eat food that's super cheap and it's going to cause me heartburn and indigestion, the probability of that occurrence has a certain probability, and I have the consequence is going to be that I'm feeling uncomfortable. So I have a risk associated with that that's an analytical equation, and then I have a fear associated with it that is just, hey, I have this unpleasant emotion. I could get heartburn if I don't eat right. Yoda had said fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. So I like to just kind of lay that out as, a lot of times we think of fear, and we are, as engineers, we think that if we're more fearful, it's going to make us a better engineer, or we'll be more risk adverse. Well, risk adverse, being risk and fear are two completely different ideas. Not saying they're not connected, but they're not the same idea. So I'm going to talk about some different types of risk here. And this little example project's one that I did a couple of years ago for development near Steamboat Springs. And I had a guy that I did wetland delineation with, that a developer wanted to put in some home sites right on the banks of the Elk River. The Elk River is one of the highest mobility bed channels that I've ever done assessment on in my life. I had a 0.016, for anybody that cares, 0.016 Shields number associated with it, or critical dimensional shear stress, which is essentially about somewhere on the order of magnitude of 4 to 5 times more mobile than what we would expect in some other rivers in the area. So that means that any particle that's out here is going to move 4 to 5 times more easily than what that same size particle would in a site that had a slightly different makeup of bed material and gradation of bed material. So all that I'm saying here is this river moves a lot. So they asked me what my thoughts were in developing 5 home sites. And these are the locations of 5 home sites, and they were on the banks of the Elk River. People like to look at the river. It's a pretty location. So I looked at it, and a lot of times risk, and when we look at risk, the first thing we think of is our FEMA flood risk. And we look at there and say, what's our probability of flooding? And a lot of times as engineers, we think of risk and probability as being exchangeable. They are not exchangeable, but we think of it, we're like, well, what's the risk of this project? Well, it's outside the floodplain. Well, no, that's just a probability of flooding, and it's a probability of a political idea of flooding. It does not mean that it won't flood. It just means that politically, nobody cares if it floods. So in Routt County, this was an old agricultural land, so nothing's mapped. They can build there just fine. That doesn't mean that people won't get flooded if there's a problem. It just means that nobody had come through before and mapped it and tried to define what the flood insurance policy should be for this region. So as we continue, these are location of the home sites by the Elk River that are most concerning. If you look at the upstream end of it up near the top of the screen, on the upstream side, you see a big footprint of a structure. And this structure was built there years ago, and it's a multi-million-dollar home. I couldn't imagine how much it actually cost in Steamboat. But you can see that they've armored the bank of it with heavy, large riprap, and then they've created a berm to keep the flood risk away from this house, and then a armored surface to keep the river from eroding into their house. So there's ways of mitigating these ideas. So the first thing we looked at was we said, okay, well, there's more than just a flooding risk. There's also a geomorphic risk to building a home right on a floodplain. So what we decided to do is we looked at a combined risk as a combination of a flood risk and a geomorphic risk. And this is different than what we're generally laid out, because a lot of times people will look at geomorphology and they'll say, okay, well, look, the river could erode into here, but they never try to put a risk on it, because geomorphologists generally don't think in the way of risk assessment, whereas engineers are trained to think of the way of risk assessment. So this is kind of a marriage between, if you will, a geomorphic engineer, something that kind of ties both flooding and geomorphic assessment together. So we looked at the bank erosion, and the bank erosion was shown for about greater than 10 foot of bank erosion per year. Our reference bank erosion rate should be about 0.25 feet of bank erosion a year. So we started looking at this and say, well, what could this look like in 25 years? So we started to just look at what the migration patterns could look like if we continued to allow this river to erode. And what we started to see is that some of these home sites would be very, very close to where we would expect erosion to occur. We also looked at the morphological parameters related to the belt width compared to the belt width compared to meander length ratios that we have on the reach. And what we see is in the Elk River and the Yampa River in Colorado and other semi-arid areas, we see a lot of these kind of mushroom curves, if you will, whereas we start to form ideas of chute cutoffs and neck cutoffs in different locations when the planform gets out of whack, and we may have something that's firm on the floodplain, or maybe just an old geologic feature that will push towards a very awkward meander pattern where the meander length ratio compared to the belt width gets so small that it encourages the formation of a chute cutoff. So we showed this, and we showed that once we get to that point that we're going to have a potential of a cutoff occurring here. And that cutoff would then isolate these home sites in the future. It may take out the home sites, but it would definitely isolate the home sites with the potential of this occurrence of this shoot cutoff. Now, the idea is generally geomorphology says there could be a shoot cutoff here, and don't build. Well, there's nothing saying these people can't build. And there's, even if I said geomorphically, you know, there's going to be a shoot cutoff, they're going to say, well, I'm still legally allowed to build there. So what we try to do is lay out the risk associated with the shoot cutoff related to the meander squirrel migration and related to the flooding. And we looked at these bank erosion rates, and then we came out, and the first one was looking at the bank erosion rate on each one of these 4 sites. The one site was in a depositional zone. We expected it to be depositional for a while. It didn't seem like it had a big chance of failure. So we looked at it and said, okay, well, what happens if we have this home site and we have erosion in the foundation? What is the cost of the occurrence? How much will it take to remedy the foundation and shore up the house if you have erosion in there? And what's the probability of this occurring? And the probability is very subjective on a lot of these things. Risk assessment, we have a lot of subjective probabilities. People want to have a firm number, but at some point we just don't know. But we do know that there's a potential for a shoot cutoff. So I looked at other areas and looked at aerial photography on Google Earth, and where I got to a certain meander length versus belt width ratio, I looked at how many years later on Google Earth before I started seeing a shoot cutoff. And I came up with a probability, about a 2% probability that this would occur in the time frame of the next 50 years is what the lifespan was on this project. So this came up with a cost. And we said, okay, well, this is the geomorphic cost of a cutoff for each of these. And this is just the cutoff, because one of the sites would not be affected by a cutoff, the other ones would. And that means they'd have to build a bridge or figure out what to do with it. And then we also looked at what the cost per the home site value is. Now, I assumed it was a $1 million home site value, but some of these homes are probably more. But we basically took the geomorphic risk plus the flooding risk, and then the total site risk. Now, the flooding risk, there was a flooding risk even though it was not a mapped flood area, because it was well within the 100-year floodplain, even though it hadn't been mapped. So there was still a flood risk to these homes. So we looked at that and we said, okay, well, all these, this is our risk on an annual basis. This is our total home site. So your annual risk as a percent of your home value on these homes is 6%, 4.7%, 5.1%, and 8.6% based on changes in morphology and bank erosion rates, potential for cutoff, and flooding. So the whole idea is we came up and said, well, how about some alternate home sites? Well, you know, people that want to pay $10 million for a home site want to be on the river. So this didn't go over real well. We were able to limit the risk on these to be about a 0.2% risk of occurrence. And that's kind of cool and stuff from an engineering standpoint, but it wasn't cool from a home site standpoint. People want to hear the running water. People want to be on the banks of the river. And there's nothing that's legally policy telling them they can't be on the banks of the river, but there is a risk associated with it. So the nature of this project was to say, okay, this is our risk, and this is your housing costs, and these are some alternatives. But if you want these housing locations here, and you want to keep them in the same place, then you're going to have to at least put in fill pads to reduce your risk of flooding. You're going to have to at least put in riprap on the banks, and you're going to have to do some sort of containment levees on one side, but it's still going to increase your risk. So we looked at some mitigation methods. We also looked at the idea of what happens if we just restored sections of the Elk River here in a place where we would expect future down valley meander migration to allow these home sites to be in a safe place. And we had discussed that, but that was a more costly adventure than the developer wanted. The developer really wanted to develop these sites, sell them to somebody, and have somebody else be able to take the risk and do all the building in the future. And they had a good property to do so on the Elk River. So it was a little disheartening on this project because we laid out the risk, we laid out some alternatives, but ultimately the developer said, well, we're just going to take fill pads. The future people that buy these lots can just do fill pads and riprap, and we're going to set up these so that they can develop right on the river, and they'll have to deal with the risk later. So the purpose of this talk is just to talk and bring out the idea of risk. I have so many projects where people say, well, did we do a risk assessment? And my question that I feel like a smart aleck on and stuff, and I said, risk assessment for what? And they're like, well, for risk. Well, but risk of what? Risk of potential geomorphic adjustment, risk of cutoff, risk of flooding, risk of aliens coming to the site, risk of a zombie apocalypse taking over your homes. I mean, what is that risk of? So I think it's important for us to start to tie in risk assessment, knowing it's a simple equation, but risk assessment can be compound. But risk can also, some risks are more important than other risks. And those things are hard to deal with as well. So next week, we're going to talk about kind of trying to incorporate risk into the MCDA tools and how to prioritize one risk over another risk, if there even are ways to look at risk. Right now, and we'll introduce MCDA a little bit more to some people. A lot of you have heard it, other ones haven't. But next week, we'll talk about MCDA and how to incorporate risk. But it's important for us to realize that risk is more than a feeling. It's an equation, and risk generally, we're not being called to do a risk analysis to tell somebody, I don't feel like you should do that project. We're being called to do a risk analysis so that we can provide numbers for somebody else to say, well, I don't feel like this is a good project to do. So those are kind of some thoughts related to risk analysis for this week. So with that, do we have any questions related to risk analysis or related to anything this week? All right, it's pretty quiet. So I'll be on the line if anybody wants to kind of discuss things. If anybody, so next week we'll be talking about risk analysis for the and tying it into the multi-criteria decisional analysis tool and how we've adjusted the MCDA over the past years to better account for goals and objectives related to risk opposed to just cost. And then related to our inspirational talk, I don't know where we'll be going next week. I had a conscious decision to kind of move away from ideas of race this week, but then I was hit so hard by this the video that I shared with you that I really wanted to share that with you. So next week we'll probably move on to something different, probably something a little bit lighter, a little bit more encouraging than stuff that can be kind of thought-provoking and deep. So with that said, I'll stay on the line. Appreciate everybody being able to have time to come and join us for a little bit of time this morning. You guys are a huge blessing to me, and I'm excited about kind of where we're going as a group. Thanks, guys.
See you, Dave.
See you, Mike.
Thanks, Dave.
Hey, see you.
Dave, I put a URL in the chat window. I don't know if it's still there. It seemed to disappear when I switched computers, but I don't know if you've ever listened to Dr. Bidelspach, but he goes into Ephesians chapter 2, verses 10 through 18, and it's a really good sermon. So goes a little in depth to it, but a good sermon.
Good. Yeah, I'll paste it in the end of the thing, and that will be the one that I'll look over it and probably save it there. I'll tell you, Jonathan, I've been yesterday we were blessed. A couple of our friends we were able to watch two of our friends' kids from over the weekend and give them a night out and stuff. And I don't know if you remember Mike Bean or not, but their kids were up at the house, and we were trying. We go to the same church, and we were trying to put on the kids' sermons yesterday morning. And Abby's trying to figure out how to make YouTube work on our TV and all of these things. And the YouTube channel, you know, they just give you things that they think you'd like because of what you search.
Right.
And a pastor named T.G. Jakes out of Dallas just came up, and it's one of those things. There's a live stream. We didn't try to find it, but the Holy Spirit wanted us to see it at the time. And we're listening to it, and T.G. Jakes is, you know, from primarily an African-American church. and my heart just broke in listening to his background on this situation, and his plea with white Americans to just stand firm with their brothers at this time. And I was just so touched by that. This morning I put together this talk, and I was listening to a guy named Stephen Furtick out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and just by chance his talk was I think his talk was I'm getting tired, or something so close to this. I have no idea. I just kind of found it, but it's it's just kind of on my heart right now. I find myself wanting to retreat from the issues of the coronavirus, from the issues of these race things, from these issues of the political 2020 campaign. I just find myself kind of wanting to retreat and just go away from everything and be like, that's the world. That's of the world. I don't need to worry about that. But I know that we're called to be in the world, but not of the world.
Right.
And at times like this, as a church, this is the time that the world needs Christ, and they're only going to see Christ through us. It's like it'd be easier just to not. But I was reminded this week that love is a sacrifice of time. Love is a sacrifice of control, and love is without having love be without having a sacrifice, we generally don't have love. So we have a sacrifice of control, opinion, and time, and that's pretty much my life right now. With my kids, do I sacrifice my time to listen to their silly stories like we discussed last week? Do I sacrifice my opinion? Do I sacrifice my control? My control over, hey, Daddy really needs to get this task done. And yes, Daddy probably needs to get this task done. But is 2 minutes out of my day to listen to an imaginary story really that important? Can I not work around that?
It's amazing how it's amazing how those little ones they tug at your heartstrings, and it's like Dad told me one day. He said, I promise you won't go to your grave asking or wanting to work a little bit more. You'll go to your grave wanting a little bit more time with your loved ones, and whether it's catching him jumping in the deep end or something like that, all Saturday afternoon when you need to do a little bit of work and stuff like that. But you enjoy it, and you enjoy looks like somebody's zonked out right now. So I hope she's feeling okay. She don't look like she feels that good, but.
Yeah, isn't this amazing, Jonathan? I can be talking for about the last hour, and she's just sleeping right through this. And I think it's a good example of kind of, if I'm being held in the arms of Christ right now, I can sleep with rest, even though everything's just crazy and loud around me.
Right. It's I don't want to ruin that sermon for you. Dave, I really. One of my friends sent it to me, and it was pretty good, or it was great in my opinion. And
Jonathan, I'll probably reach out to you right after I watch it and stuff. What I've found is that God builds relationships and gives people thoughts for plan and purpose, and so often we're not bold enough to follow up on those thoughts because we don't want to get in the way of people's time or opinions.
Yeah.
I'll reach out to you.
All righty. Well, you have a good week, Dave.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. I really appreciate it, man. Have an amazing week.
You too. Bye.
Hey, Dave.
Ed Gesnev.
It's Stallman.
Hey,
Thanks
Matt.
for your message. An interesting audio clip there. I mean, from north of the border, it sounds improbable in a way from my sheltered existence. But anyways, a lot of issues here, even in Canada. So we're not free of that stuff. I'm sure there's some of that latent bigotry around here too. But I have a technical question. I just was wondering on that, you had that slide of the cutoff. going on between those houses, and then you had a slide showing the risk, and you had years before major, I had to call it up, so I'm looking at it right now. Years before major cutoff, channel evolution or cutoff, or shoot cutoff, 50 years. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, so and this is only appropriate for the Elk River and the Yampa River basins.
Yeah.
But I've been blessed with doing a lot of work in that area, and I realized a number of years ago in doing some landowner dispute type of issues that the meander patterns have a kind of a mushroom meander that occurs. It's not quite a shoot cutoff or a neck cutoff, but it kind of gets to a point where the meander wavelength gets so short compared to the belt width that it gets very predictable that we're going to have a shoot cutoff that occurs at that point. So when I looked at that, I went through probably close to 100 miles of stream on the Yampa and the Elk River, and just looked at where we had seen these cutoffs that occurred. And I was blessed because I happened to have another project that I worked on right before this that was related to force de majeure, and it was a expert witness case for a property boundary, and the idea of act of God in Colorado law. If a river evolves slowly and has a slight change in course, your property boundaries will adjust with that river's change of course. If the river has an evulsion, it's considered force de majeure or an act of God, and there's no change in property boundaries. So we had already done a lot of that assessment when we came around here, so we just added on and started looking at where do these evulsions occur. And that geomorphic feature, that mushroom bend, if you will, which isn't even really in published literature, it's just so unique to a lot of these rivers that it's kind of what I've been calling it over the years. That has that on average, once it hits that certain length to width ratio, you have a high probability of that occurring within kind of the next 50 years. So we looked at it and said, hey, within 20 years after this starts to occur, we start to see some sort of failure on 50% of these. So that gets us about somewhere close to a 50-year storm event that we can assume causes these. Now, there's a lot of assumptions in there, but at least it gets us a starting point. So,
okay, awesome. So related to the river that you're on, you had some experience on it anyways. Okay, good.
Yeah, and what I would say is if you don't have experience on something like that, and it's harder in the east because when you have a smaller river you're trying to do these assessments on in the east, a lot of times what happens is that you can't see with tree cover. So Google Earth doesn't help you as much. But in the west, we're blessed because, we don't have much tree cover. So from a geomorphic assessment, we can glean a lot more information from it. And we have aerial photography that's shown up on Google Earth that's, pretty old. But then we also, with the overlay function on Google Earth, I can take any aerial photography that comes from any source, put in Google Earth in a matter of a minute, and then it's pretty well set. And sometimes we have scaling issues, but it gives us an ability to look at things really rapidly now. So.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting site nonetheless. All what I see on that air photo is erosion scars.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
So,
constantly along the entire valley, and that the lifespan of that ranch, the last 100 years, that river, they may think of it as, hey, that river's just over there, it hasn't moved much, but they're not living right on that river. They're living up on a high terrace away from the river because somebody 100 years ago was smarter than them and put that barn up on a high terrace.
way out, yeah. Anyways, this past Sunday, or yesterday, I should say, is we were back at church. How is you guys back at church as well?
Yeah, we go to a mega church type of thing in Fort Collins, and we opened up, and they said separate rooms, and then they have separate entrances, so they treat it like multiple churches just to kind of get people in the room, but they're still required to have 6-foot social distances, and you still have to have masks, and there's no childcare. So we've been blessed. Honestly, I've been so blessed by this pandemic. We've been watching probably 3 to 4 sermons a Sunday now, whereas we never would before. And, you know, we're having kids churches and stuff that we're doing from different locations. So it's just different, you know, but God can still use it. And it's amazing to me how what I thought was so sacred about attending a church, I'm starting to realize even more than I had before, that the true church is just a body of believers. And, you know, today was church, you know, this morning was church. This is church, you know, and that's amazing to me. But we are going back to church as our family. We're not rushing back there yet. We're waiting to see. Our pastor had said, if you don't mind staying home, just keep on staying home for a little bit longer. Colorado is a very, they have a little bit stricter laws than some of the other states do right now. So. Yeah.
No, we just, on Friday, the government said you can have 30% capacity at your church.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And we knew that was coming up. So on Wednesday, we went for it. We decided to go, like, put that in. So there's a lot of churches around us that haven't even started yet because they didn't have their feet in the ground ready to go. But so yeah, we've been blessed, but it's 30%. So we ended up having, as opposed to morning and evening service, we had another service stuck in there so that 30, 30, 30, kind of 100% of the people could go. So it was pretty good.
That's right.
Yeah. So,
yeah, we saw one of the churches that we'll listen to a bunch of the church house near Seattle, Washington, called Crossroads. And what was it? I think they had close to 10 services this week. Just because the same thing, trying to allow people to kind of get in the door, but then they broadcast all of them the same way just because it's easy enough to broadcast. So it makes it really easy to get a time to listen to them. Normally they have 3, but that's probably close to the same thing. But it'll be
awesome.
It'll be interesting. It's going to be a memorable year, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. 2020. I can see clearly now.
You know, honestly, what I would say is sometimes our clearest vision is through the fog. So things get so cloudy, and then we just realize what's really important for us. And in a lot of ways, 2020 does represent that. I'm tired, but in other ways, you know, I'm just seeing things differently. My eyes are open to things that they weren't open to before in different ways.
Yeah. Anyways, brother, thanks very much. Have a good one.
Hey, thank you. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.